In this last video of this unit, we're going to put all that we've learned about functions together and write one semi-complicated program that illustrates the use of functions to make your code very modular and easier to read. I'm probably making this a little bit more complicated than needed, but it should be a good illustration of how you can use functions in your program. So for our demonstration of functions, we're going to look at a simple program that converts Fahrenheit to Celsius. We're going to get a Fahrenheit temperature from our user, convert it, and then print the result back. And here's a basic flowchart I did to illustrate the steps in that. So once the program starts, we're going to print out the instructions so the user knows what the program's doing. We're going to get input, we're going to do a conversion, we're going to reprint that result, and then end the program. Once you get a bit more sophisticated, we might have an option for the user to say if they want to do another conversion, and then this would go back to the beginning and do it as many times as the user would like. But we'll do that in upcoming units. So let's go back to PyCharm and let's start to implement that flowchart. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define my main function. And sometimes what makes it easier is you write down the functions you're going to need and then you go back and write them later. So I know for my flowchart that the first thing I was going to do was going to be to print instructions. And then I knew I was going to have to get user input, and then I was going to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, and then I was going to print the result. And here's my last line of my program. I always need to put main, because that tells Python to go ahead and run the main program, which then in turn runs these different functions. Notice I've got a lot of red underlines. All that means is I haven't written those functions yet. But that's the general outline of what I'm going to do. So let's go ahead and start writing some of these functions. And we'll write them up top since main should be our last function. So let's define print instructions. Now print instructions is just going to print anything. It doesn't need any parameters. So in our print instructions function, let's write out what our program does and what we expect from the user. So let's start by writing print. This program converts Fahrenheit to Celsius. I don't know how to spell Fahrenheit off the top of my head, so I'm just putting F to C for right now. And then print, please enter a temperature in Fahrenheit. I'll give it a shot. I think that's pretty close. Okay? And since we're not returning anything, I don't need a return statement for this function. It's just going to, once it's called, it'll print these two lines and then come back and go to the next function. Okay? So I need to get some user input as my next function. So I'm going to define get user input. And since I don't have anything to pass from it, I don't need to have any parameters for this one. So I'll do a, let's see, Fahrenheit equals input, enter temp. So that's going to prompt the user to enter the temperature, and it'll store whatever they enter as the value of Fahrenheit. Since my other functions are going to need the value of Fahrenheit, I have to return it to them somehow. So let's go ahead and return the Fahrenheit function. But remember that anything from an input is saved as a string, and I'm going to need Fahrenheit to be a number, whether an integer or as a float. And it's always, in general, a good idea to return a float. So I'm going to return float Fahrenheit. So it's going to take the value of whatever Fahrenheit was, whatever the user entered, convert it to a float, and then return that value. And I'll have to save that value as a variable. So what I've done is after the instructions are printed, I do get user input. Whatever value is returned is saved in the variable temperature. Now, convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. So I'm going to define it. convert F to C. Well, I need to get a temperature, so I need a temperature as a parameter. So I know it'll take one parameter. And I know that my Celsius equals 5 divided by 9 times whatever my temperature is minus 32. I think that's the right formula. So I'm going to take the Fahrenheit temperature minus 32, multiply it by 5 divided by 9, and save that value as Celsius. And then I can go ahead and return Celsius. So once I'm done calculating it, I return that value back to my function. So in my convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, since that function requires a parameter, it means I have to send it some information. I'm actually going to send it the value of temperature that I received when I got my user input. So we're almost done, but notice that it's returning Celsius, but I'm not saving it anywhere. So I'm going to take result, and when it runs convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, returns it, and it assigns that value to the result variable. Okay. I have one last function, the print result, and it's print result. I know it's going to take a parameter, I'll call it result, and I'm going to print the temperature in Celsius is, and I do a comma, and then result, the variable result. It doesn't need to return anything because it's not bringing any values back, so I'm done with that function. It's going to take in a result as a parameter, it's going to print this string, and then result afterwards. The last thing I need to do though is I have to, since it's taking a result as a parameter, I have to send it from this function, and I'm sending it this value here. So let's just go ahead and go over this one more time to see what happens and see the flow of the program, and then we'll run it and see if it works. So the first thing that it goes through, it sees the call to the main function. First line of main function says print instructions. It prints these two lines, returns down here. It gets the user input. Once this value is returned, it's stored in this variable. I then pass that variable to my convert Fahrenheit to Celsius function. There's a calculation done. It returns a variable. That is then saved in the variable result. And then result is passed to the print result function. It prints it out, and we're done. So let's see how this is going to work. Let's run it. This program converts Fahrenheit to Celsius. Please enter temperature in Fahrenheit. Well, we know that, let's see what 32 is. We know what 32 should be. It should be 0. Temperature in Celsius is 0. So it worked. Let's run it one more time. I think that the boiling point of water is 212, which is 100 in Celsius. And so those are two numbers we can check to see if our program worked. So that's kind of an overview of how you write functions in Python. We've seen functions that take no parameters. We've seen functions that take one parameter. We've seen functions that return values and functions that don't return values. But hopefully you can see that this is very easy to read and follow from a human user. It's very easy to see the steps that this program took. The last thing I need to do before my program is completed is to make sure to add document strings or doc strings to each of my functions. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So for the print instructions, I'll put in my 3 quotes, and I can say this function takes no parameters and prints out instructions to the user. And it automatically puts in this return for me, and I'll just put none for return. For gather user input, put my 3 quotes. So for this function I would put takes no parameters, returns the temperature as a float, gets input from the user. Again, that tells exactly what this function does. For my convert Fahrenheit to Celsius function, triple quotes, notice that it automatically detects that temperature is the parameter, so I can just say this function converts Fahrenheit, converts a temperature in Fahrenheit to temperature in Celsius. And it returns a float. Obviously, it returns Celsius as a float. If I can type. And then finally, my print result function. 3 quotes. Parameter already has the result. And returns nothing. And it prints the result of the calculation. So now all of my functions will have document strings and explains exactly what each of them do. So that wraps up our unit on functions. In the next unit we'll start taking a look at decisions and loops.